Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We got to get started. Our live stream is live. Let's go. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to PGP, Pretty Good Policy for Crypto. I'm Paul Brigner, the organizer of this initiative and Vice President of Strategic Alliances at the Electric Coin Company. We're the developers of Zcash. Thank you all for joining today, both online and in person, and being part of this community. So good to see you all as we come together to share information and build a stronger crypto policy community and drive forward with pretty good policy for crypto. I want to thank many of you for joining last month's DC Privacy Summit. If you had to miss that, you can see all of those informative sessions on the PGP for Crypto YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@PGP for Crypto, and you'll see all of those great sessions. At our last meeting in September, I announced a couple of new sponsors, the Digital Securities Initiative, or DSI, and Zcash. I'm thrilled today to have two more sponsors to announce. We're on a roll here. Hedera Hashgraph and Ernst & Young have come on to help support this initiative. These sponsors make this possible, and we are deeply grateful for their support. I also want to thank our existing sponsors and supporters, including Electric Coin Company, the Blockchain Association, DeFi Education Fund, and last but not least, this beautiful venue is made possible by the VanEck Digital Assets Initiative, or VITA for short, at the University of Southern California, right here in DC. Before we get started with lightning talks, I have to apologize in advance. I have to leave a bit early today. I am a member of the Blockchain Advisory Council for the Joint Committee on Technology and Science for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I'll be racing to Richmond right after the lightning talks to participate in that advisory council meeting. So I hate to miss it. This is the first time I've ever missed any part of one of these meetings, but thanks for understanding. All right, let's get started with our lightning talks. We have a number of great speakers for you today. We are very fortunate to have Summer Mercier, CEO of Blockchain Association, give our policy update today. First time she's been at a PGP, I believe. So Summer, please welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for fighting traffic to be here this morning. I don't know how many people drove in, but it was a bit of a nightmare, so we're all happy to be here. I'm very lucky to give you a policy update today because on Monday we had Chris Lucas from the Senate Banking Committee speak to our membership, and yesterday we had Nathan Anonik from the Senate Agriculture Committee speak to our membership. So we got really good updates that I'm excited to share with you. It's been about 6 months now that I've been CEO of the Blockchain Association. It's been a pretty wild 6 months. I kind of joke that we've lived a few years in that 6 months, but it's been great to see what we've accomplished, and it's great to see what's ahead and what we can accomplish down the road. Probably the biggest thing or the biggest concern everyone had was that the government shutdown was really going to slow down the regulatory process, the legislative process, and kind of just push everything back. I actually think now that the government's open, the regulatory side, it probably did push things back a little bit. I had met with Chair Atkins a couple weeks ago. At the time, he was saying, there was a lot of things that he had hoped to accomplish by the end of November, December, that were just backed up because he didn't have staff. Now that his staff's back, I assume they're going to move quickly on a lot of these initiatives, one of them being kind of the parameters or more instructions around what the innovation exemption is going to look like, which will be, I think, really interesting and something that will be a big benefit to the industry. On the Hill, interestingly enough, sometimes when there's a shutdown, that allows staff to keep working. They have fewer meetings, fewer hearings, everything just kind of slows down. So it allows them to, stop and work on legislation, and that's really what we saw was a lot of work going on, even though the government was shut down. We saw the Democrats' proposal, which was was pretty far outside of the what was going to be acceptable, but they did spend some time putting that together. I know that after that, then it just kind of helped bring everyone back to the table to talk, and start working on this in a bipartisan manner. Where we are now, in the Senate Banking Committee, they're meeting daily with the Democrats and Republicans are meeting every day for hours, not an hour, not 30 minutes like you would normally do on the Hill, hours in a room together. That tells me they're really serious about this. You usually don't lock yourself in a room with the other party staff unless you really are going to get something done. So I do think they're making progress. I know that they're ticking off a lot of the subjects that are a little bit easier, that aren't as controversial. They're kind of getting those out of the way first, and then they're really going to dig into some of the more controversial issues. And one of them, it's going to be the DeFi provision. And so that's something we're going to watch really closely, how they try to go, deal with that. Title V is good the way it is. We really don't want to see changes. So we'll be working closely with the Banking Committee on that. On the agriculture side, you probably all saw their draft, which was pretty light on details. Everyone asked me, what did the bracketed language mean? And I said, it means one of two things. If everybody yells about it, it means we never intended to have that in our bill. If nobody says a word, it means we've always intended on having that in our bill. So it's kind of a trick that's used a lot on Capitol Hill when you are still negotiating language, but want to get something out for public feedback. And for Blockchain Association members, we're taking input, taking feedback, going to compile that and send it up to Capitol Hill. I think we're doing that today. So looking forward to getting that, what's most important to our members, getting that in front of the Senate Agriculture staff so they can hopefully make some changes around some of the issues where they're just, not necessarily the areas where there are no details, because we just need to see what's going to come out there. But there are some issues where there's just need to be some tweaks and some fixes. So we're hopeful that when we send up our feedback from the BA, that helps kind of guide those issues so that we can tackle what will be the bigger issues. Again, DeFi, they have a section on anti-money laundering, but no details, just bracketed. We've got a lot of questions around what that means and what they think would fit in there. I think a lot of people would argue there's no reason to do anything. The law is the law, and there's no reason to apply it differently to digital assets than any other asset class. So it'll be kind of interesting to see what they have in mind with that section. The administration outside of the SEC, I know CFTC has their crypto sprint. We've been working on looking for some exemptive relief around perpetuals, hopefully allowing that market to be accessed by retail participants here in the U.S. So we're hoping to get that to CFTC and see, hopefully some movement on that, because that's a huge market. It's all offshore. It really should be within the U.S. I mean, if you think about it, you kind of want that within the borders, but also, if you're a regulator, you would think you'd want that within your regulatory remit too. So I think we'll probably see some activity around perpetuals coming out of the CFTC. Tokenized collateral is another one that I think the CFTC is looking very closely at. That's an interesting issue because, in theory, if you're a clearinghouse, a registered clearinghouse at the CFTC, you could on your own say, we're going to accept stablecoins as collateral, or we're going to accept digital assets as collateral. And then they would determine, if they're going to haircut it, what the haircutting would look like, what that asset means, or the value that it assigns to it. But I think a lot of the clearinghouses are a little bit nervous about being the first mover here. And so in the way I see it is they would really like CFTC guidance before doing anything on their own, even though they do have, the way the CEA is set up, they do have the ability to kind of decide what collateral they want to take and how they want to haircut it to make it, to value it. So I think I expect to see some kind of guidance there from the CFTC on tokenized collateral. Working closely with the White House, they are very invested on market structure. They see this as, kind of this another win for crypto under President Trump. I'm sure most of you know Patrick Witt. He's on the Hill all the time. Every time I talk to an office, they'll say, well, Patrick Witt was just in here meeting with me. So they're doing kind of the shoe leather lobbying work of trying to get market structure going and figuring out how to find bipartisan deals, where the White House can pull levers to help. And I think having the White House behind getting a bill done really does say to me that there is still some momentum. I know a lot of people are have kind of thought, well, this is dead, it's not going anywhere, it's too hard to get done. I don't disagree that it's too hard to get done, but I've seen some pretty amazing things come out of bipartisan discussions in the Senate, especially when you've got the two sides really committed to getting something done, and when you have the White House behind you. So I actually think that shows that there's a lot of momentum. I think you probably all saw Tim Scott's comments yesterday that they really are looking more beginning of next year. Again, not surprising. The shutdown, I don't think that really slowed them down. I just think it's that hard to get agreement on these issues that trying to push it through by the end of the year is just impossible. So I do think, they could turn to this early next year. They'll also have a government funding fight again at the same time, so there will be competing interests for sure. But I do feel like we could see bipartisan market structure on the floor of the Senate in early 2026. And the other thing I'll just mention, we've had kind of a campaign that we've been working on, pushing back on the banks, mostly around for them it's the yield issue, for us it's the reward issue for stablecoins. We want to make sure that Genius isn't reopened. We think it's settled law. It's only been a couple months. Let's let this law go into effect. There's rulemakings and studies that need to happen. So this idea that we'd reopen Genius on market structure is not a good idea at all. And I think we just have to be vocal in the opposition on this. At the end of the day, the good news is I think we're on the side of consumers here. In my mind, this idea of you shouldn't be able to pay rewards, well, why shouldn't the consumers get rewards for holding stable coins? Why should we take that money out of the consumers' pockets? And I think that's a question that we need to be asking the banks and others who are looking at this. Why is the consumer not, why shouldn't we give that money to consumers versus say, well, we need people in support of reopening it and making some changes, so it's something we're going to have to really watch going forward. And with that, I would love to take questions. Is that okay? How much time do we have here?
Let's take a couple questions
Yeah.
if we have any. I think that's a great idea. We don't get you here that often. So I'm going to grab one of these mics. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Testing? Yes? Yeah? Considering it? No?
It's early.
Okay. Carl.
Morning, my name's Carl Schonander. So on the risk-reward, whatever you want to call it, issue, I'm presuming the banks remain opposed to allowing rewards. Is that the main fault line here, or are there others we should be aware of?
Now, that's the main fault line here, and the way the banks are framing it is that's just yield with another name, that this is getting around the no yield payments that was in Genius Act. I think there are some concerns from maybe the community banks that, with being able to kind of the state charter issue, that there could be like new competition at the state level as well. But that doesn't seem to be the overall issue. The overwhelming issue is really this idea that the rewards to them, they say it looks like yield. I think the biggest problem is that means if you want to hold consumers' money, you're going to have to start paying them more. Because if you can put your money in a stable coin and earn 3, 4, 5%, if you're choosing between that and a deposit account at a bank, which has less than 1% yield or rates, it makes no sense to go with the banks. And so at the end of the day, the banks will have to raise those interest rates in my mind. And so that's really where the fight is, because I don't think they want to have more money out of pocket to keep, depositors within the banking system.
Thanks. Yeah, that was my understanding as well. What do you say to those who say, correct me if I've got this wrong, that stable coins aren't just a form of investment, but really are supposed to develop into a payment mechanism? And if that's the case, why do you need rewards / interest / yield, whatever you want to call it?
I think some of it is just a matter of, the way the stablecoins are structured, the reserves that are held are made, they are earning yields. And honestly, in my opinion, we should have allowed yields. We should have allowed consumers to have yields. Anytime you can get more money in the consumer's pockets, that's what we should be for. So I think at the end of the day, I guess the question is, who's losing out on the money here? And in my mind, regardless of what you classify a stablecoin as, if there is some, stream of money that's coming in, however this money is being held, the consumers should have access to that. And with the rewards, I think that is a really, it's a good setup for the exchanges, gets people more interested in stable coins, gets them in this space. But at the end of the day, however you define a stable coin or whatever you think it's going to be, there's still going to be money held to back it up. There's still going to be interest accumulating on that money. And that really should, in some form, go back to consumers, in my mind.
I think we only have time for one more, and then we have to move on.
Thank you. Kyler Phillips, just a quick question. You mentioned that BA supports, the Title V DeFi provisions as they are. In your conversations with the Democratic offices that issued the leaked proposed changes, is this sort of like a hard line in the sand for them? Like, do they need changes to Title V before they support market structure? Or are they sort of willing to maybe see, concessions in other areas to support the bill?
I think they're still learning. I've spent a lot of time in these offices, especially after they put their proposal out, and a lot of it was just explaining what the problem was. For a number of the members, when they put their proposal out and they said this will not impact, people who are writing software or code, people creating code, they really thought that was a savings clause and that everybody would be happy with that. But when you started to get into details, it's like, well, you said if you deploy code, you have to register. Deploying code, if you write code, if you want it out there, you're gonna deploy it. And they were shocked that they didn't think of it that way. So I think a lot of it is more they are catching up on the kind of what DeFi is, and they're still looking at it as there's some kind of centralized organization controlling everything, and they can come in and flip a switch and change how things are traded or how money's held. And I think trying to help them understand that, again, we're talking about developers, we're talking about code, we're talking about protocols, we're not talking about centralized entities. I think that's helping them get to the right place. And their big thing is on kind of anti-money laundering. And again, explaining to them that there are on-ramps and off-ramps to DeFi. And those areas are, they go through AML KYC. So this concern that there's no AML KYC happening in DeFi is really a false narrative. And so helping them understand those sorts of kind of misconceptions, I think, has brought them closer to where Section 5 is. Now, whether or not they get all the way there, I don't know. I think they're being pretty quiet about where they are with those negotiations, but I think a lot of it's just a fundamental misunderstanding and the need to really be educated on what DeFi is and what it means to be a DeFi protocol. Yeah.
Summer, do you have time for just one more? Okay.
Just for Gerald.
One more. Hey, thanks for doing this, Summer. Good to see you. So I know you guys have also been focused more on the state level initiatives, and just on this sort of note, I was wondering, so there's, I think, like a confusing kind of announcement that came out of Nebraska where they had like the first crypto bank, right? And then, of course, that probably doesn't make like Anchorage folks seem super happy. I think the governor of Wyoming kind of clapped back a little bit, the governor of Nebraska. This was very interesting. I was just wondering if you could talk at all about how states are approaching stables and like this integration of banking and some of the new products that we're offering.
Yeah, a lot of the states we're going into, they're coming to us saying, we don't know anything about this. And so can you just come and educate us on what the Genius Act does, what it's about, what we should be thinking about on the state level. So that's kind of where we're going and weighing in is on with those states that are really just not sure what it all means. And honestly, with some of them that are maybe going in the wrong direction, I think there's also a little bit of that they don't understand what it means either. So right now, I think the way the states are looking at it is we need to understand this because this impacts, this impacts our banking industry, this impacts, the financial system within our state, so we need to better understand it. And it's great to see the states who are willing to raise their hand and say, come educate us because we don't know what this means. So it's kind of more of less of a like the states are taking a specific direction and more of we just need help understanding this so we know what direction to take.
Summer, do you want to mention the upcoming Blockchain Association Policy Summit?
Thank you. Yes, we have our annual policy summit coming up on December 8th and 9th. We've got a great lineup of speakers. Chairman Atkins will be there. Hester Peirce has confirmed. We've got a number of members of Congress who have confirmed. A lot of great panels planned. Hopefully we see all of our members there. If you're not a member and you're interested in becoming a member, the Policy Summit is a member benefit. It's only available to our members, so happy to talk about membership and how you get in the doors of the Policy Summit. But it's going to be a really good, the content this year is going to be really, really interesting with a lot of really great speakers. So I hope to see some of you there. And again, if you have any questions, actually Dan Spooler is in the back here. He's our head of membership. So if you have any questions about membership, corner Dan, and he can tell you all about the application process and about the member benefits that we have, like the Policy Summit. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was quite a comprehensive update. Thank you so much, Summer, for being here. Thank you, Blockchain Association, for your support and for your industry leadership. A couple takeaways that I had from that initial talk was, ironically, government gets stuff done when they shut down. and if we all yell really loud about that bracketed AML KYC section, it just goes away. So I think we know what to do now, right? I'm very excited about that. Okay, let's move on. We have some remote speakers today. We have Taylor Reed. He's a tax policy advisor and a digital assets advisor. He's been in the industry a very long time. He's been here many times. He can't be here today, but I'm so thankful that he's going to give us an update on what's happening in tax, which is such an important issue. Taylor, to you.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity to update the group on the status of efforts to clarify the taxation of digital assets. To date, most legislative and regulatory attention has been focused on stablecoins, market structure, and illicit finance. But in recent months, crypto tax has finally caught the attention of lawmakers. The House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees held hearings on the topic in the past few months, and there are legislative proposals floating around that have pretty broad bipartisan support. Now the government is reopened, I do think that we could see a crypto tax bill in this session of Congress. Today, however, I wanted to report on a couple of very recent developments that may be of interest to this group. First, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, posted a notice last Friday announcing that proposed rules for the implementation of CARF, which is the Crypto Asset Reporting Framework, into the broker reporting regulations under Section 6045 have been sent to the White House for review. So that means this has been an ongoing regulatory project that's been out there for some time, but it has now reached the state of development where it's now at the White House for review. So I think we're pretty close on CARF implementation. Just by way of background for those who aren't familiar with the broker reporting rules or CARF, thought I'd go through that for a couple of minutes. You may recall that regulations were finalized in July of 2024, so about a year and a half ago, providing for information reporting by custodial brokers of digital assets. And what those rules do is require brokers to report to taxpayers and the IRS on the gross proceeds from dispositions of digital assets starting January 1st of 2026. So it's coming up. We'll start to see our first 1099 DAs from brokers like Coinbase and Kraken and the like starting next year. Regulations were also finalized in December 2024 that would have required similar reporting for DeFi transactions, but those regulations were repealed by Congress after President Trump took office. So right now, these rules apply to custodial brokers. So what is CARF, and what does it mean to integrate CARF into those existing broker reporting rules? Well, CARF is a regime for the exchange of information on digital asset transactions between tax authorities. This was formulated by the OECD in 2022. And so to point out the obvious, because it's an OECD document, it is not law. It is essentially a draft law, and needs to be adopted into the laws of member states in order to become law in those countries. CARF is similar in purpose to the FATCA regime that was created to exchange information between tax authorities on traditional financial transactions, and that's been out there for years. So to some extent, this is not new. It's sort of extending the concept now to digital assets. So far, more than 60 countries have committed to implement CARF in their national law. The EU has already done so. The US is committed to do so by 2028. And the Section 6045 custodial broker regulations acknowledged that the US rules would need adjustment in order to implement CARF, and at the same time reaffirmed the 2028 timetable. Finally, the White House Crypto Task Force on in its digital assets report from July recommended that Treasury and the IRS should move forward with proposed regulations to implement CARF, but that, quote, take stakeholder concerns into account and minimize burdens on brokers. So sort of signaling a cautious and measured approach. The report also noted that any such proposed regulations, quote, should not impose any new reporting requirements on DeFi transactions. And as I noted a minute ago, the DeFi regulations were repealed. So since there aren't any reporting requirements on DeFi transactions right now, saying that there should not be any new reporting requirements on DeFi transactions might or might not be a signal that the administration does not intend for CARF to apply to DeFi, at least the U.S. implementation of it. So what does this mean for our digital asset broker reporting regime? Well, CARF doesn't replace the U.S. rules. It would complement the existing rules. And the reason is the two regimes really have different purposes and scope. Section 6045 is intended to provide information to both the taxpayer and the IRS. So the taxpayer has the information they need to file their return on potential capital gains and losses, and the IRS has information that helps with identifying risks of compliance. So it's intended to facilitate our existing voluntary compliance regime. But it provides, to that end, provides information on specific transactions. So the taxpayer knows how much gain they had on a particular transaction. CARF, on the other hand, is really only intended to provide tax authorities with information, and specifically to allow them to assess non-compliance risks. And to that end, it only provides aggregate data on each taxpayer, not transaction by transaction. The current Section 6045 custodial broker regs have reserved sort of a placeholder in the regulations relating to the application of the U.S. rules to non-U.S. brokers. The proposed regulations had extensive rules under which the U.S. broker reporting rules would have applied to various categories of non-U.S. brokers. But the reason it was reserved in the final regs from July of 2024 was to leave room for the implementation of CARF. In the absence of CARF, if CARF isn't implemented, then the Section 6045 rules likely would be, I would think, would be amended to apply to many non-U.S. brokers, requiring them to file reports directly with the IRS. If CARF is implemented in the U.S., the way this would work is the IRS would collect information from U.S. brokers only and share aggregate information about non-U.S. persons that do business with those U.S. brokers with the tax authorities of the country of their residence, and foreign tax authorities would collect information from brokers in their country and share that aggregate information about U.S. persons with the U.S. So it's an exchange of information. So some final notes on CARF. It's only effective between countries that have adopted CARF into their national law. So it's a mutual exchange regime. It does require the implementation. In order for a country to come on board, they have to implement a variety of data privacy and security safeguards for the safeguarding taxpayer information. And CARF, by its terms, but the CARF regime does apply to some forms of DeFi. But the current administration seems, by my read, seems disinclined to impose information reporting obligations on DeFi. So perhaps the U.S. flavor of this would not go so far. The other item I wanted to just make folks aware of, many of you probably are already aware of this, but is some developments on staking, specifically staking by exchange-traded products, exchange-traded funds. Staking and mining, I think many of you know, presents a variety of novel tax issues. For example, the most contentious of those is the timing of income for tax purposes. Is staking income services income that's taxable when it's received, or is it income from self-created property that's taxed when the property is sold? A less well-known issue, but one of critical importance to the many crypto ETFs that launched this year, is whether the ETF will still qualify as an investment trust that is a grantor trust if it stakes the crypto assets that it holds. This is very important to the tax treatment of these funds and the impact it has on their shareholders, on their stakeholders. The IRS issued a revenue procedure 2025-31 on November 10th that provides some very helpful guidance on this issue, indicating that an investment trust can be treated as a trust for this purpose, but that the sort of existing law on this is that the trust must have no power. There must be no power under the trust agreement to vary the investments of the certificate holders, and that's sort of the question: is whether staking somehow is an activity that would trip over that. The revenue procedure provides a safe harbor under which an investment trust that stakes digital assets can qualify as a trust if certain requirements are met. And amongst those that I think people will have to sort of debate around a little bit in terms of whether they present an issue for the way existing crypto ETFs are operating is that the assets have to be staked through a staking provider unrelated to the fund and its sponsor. The trust sponsor and custodian of the assets cannot control, and query what control means in this context, the staking provider. Assets have to be staked at all times with some limited exceptions related to liquidity. Assets have to be indemnified against slashing. The funds can only own one type of asset, so mixed asset ETFs would be a problem here, and staking rewards must be distributed at least quarterly. Unanswered questions here is whether staking income of non-U.S. investors is effectively connected income with effectively connected with the U.S. trade or business, whether staking income is U.S. source income subject to 30% withholding tax, and whether staking income is unrelated business taxable income for tax-exempt investors. So more to come on this, but certainly a very positive development for the industry. Back to you, Paul.
This one, Taylor, thank you so much. It's just incredible how much knowledge we have in our community, and I'm so thankful to have experts like you working in the space to explain this to us. I saw some kind of concerning headlines over the last few weeks, and you just kind of explained all that away in a like brief masterclass. So that was amazing. I want to mention we have a guest here with us who's relatively new in his role at Wave Digital Assets. Jim Robinette, he's the Chief of Government Operations there at Wave. But on the issue of tax, he was with the IRS for over 30 years and was Deputy Chief of the Criminal Investigation Division there. So if you want to have a conversation about probably all the things he talked about and many other things, you should meet Jim here. And thanks again for all of that information. Outstanding. Okay, our next speaker is Catherine Kirkpatrick Boz. She's a general counsel of Starkware, and she's going to talk to us about a paper she wrote, Trust Without Intermediaries. And I'm going to make sure she's featured on the Zoom. 1 second.
Hi, all. I think I see myself on the Zoom.
You're ready to go. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person, particularly as a USC alum. I'm familiar with that space. It's beautiful. So I'll give you an overview of this paper. I co-wrote it with Jesse Brooks, who is the GC of Ribbit Capital, the venture fund. Jesse is formerly a longtime AUSA, who dealt with national security work, amongst other things. I am obviously GC of Starkware. I'm an ex-DeFi GC and also an ex-centralized exchange CLO after many years of being a partner at King & Spalding in government investigations. So Jesse and I share the belief that crypto and DeFi are in the process of maturation. And there's a way to improve upon the status quo within DeFi without re-intermediating DeFi or necessarily regulating DeFi. But if DeFi wants to continue to take the position of, a total lack of regulation, then there needs to be a holistic maturation within the kind of risk architecture of DeFi. So table setting, the paper is not about requiring, but about suggesting protocol level optionality where risk management tools can be natively embedded in smart contracts or token standards, things that can effectively operate completely under the hood within DeFi without dictating how users interact or builders build. And the goal of the piece was really to start a conversation with legislators and policymakers, regulators, but also to suggest possible features for builders who may want to engage with institutional or regulated participants, builders who might have a lower appetite for risk. So these protocols at the building phase, along with their community, can adopt what fits their design and values. And we think that this conversation makes particular sense at this stage where we have traditional players coming online and we're seeing a convergence to a certain degree within, kind of DeFi and trad markets. We don't want, nor do we think it's possible to have kind of a one-size-fits-all model. As we all know, there's kind of a massive spectrum within DeFi, from the truly total permissionless architecture to a somewhat permissioned architecture. Query whether someone consider that DeFi a conversation at a different time. But the idea is to really enable these capabilities and educate individuals, builders, and regulators on the options that exist today. And we really believe a lot of this is technically feasible without forcing design changes or disruptions to the UX. The whole point is kind of to strive for conversation, experimentation, interoperability, and educate a lot of people on the existence of these tools, as opposed to imposing some sort of compliance template on DeFi, which is particularly unadvisable since no one can agree wholly on what DeFi is. That was actually one of our biggest struggles, was kind of the definition of DeFi, and that is really up for debate and is obviously creating some issues and some friction with the legislative environment vis-a-vis DeFi. So moving a little specifically more to risk scoring. The paper focuses on standards for risk scoring within this kind of environment of programmable risk management, meaning particularly the ability to use on-chain data, identity attestations, behavioral heuristics, and smart contract logic. And all of this maintains DeFi's openness while focusing attention and controls where risk is greatest, thereby aligning kind of the technical realities with policymakers' objectives and concerns. A few important points to make about all of this. A lot of you are aware that risk scoring is already being used in crypto and has been used in TradFi for many years. This is a natural process of maturation, and risk scoring is uniquely well suited within DeFi. So a risk scoring paradigm particularly makes sense because it leverages the data-rich features inherent to blockchain-based tech. In TradFi, the data is really siloed across intermediaries and institutions, but in DeFi, we're working with public immutable ledgers that can serve as dynamic engines. So this means these systems can adapt and respond in real time or even prior to transaction execution itself. On that point, before we get a little bit to Minority Report, that Tom Cruise movie where they anticipated crimes, I want to talk briefly about data inputs and metrics. So the beauty of all of this is, and again, this technology exists today. These risk inputs can be tailored to jurisdictions, users, goals of the community, and the focus, we're encouraging the focus to be on transparency, behavior, and verifiable proof. So the specific parameters we discuss in the paper are wallet or address level transaction history, provenance data, the lineage, verifiable credentials. One example of that being used right now is the Solana attestation service. And, my personal favorite, the use of ZK proofs. This also means that a protocol could have layers of verification with a design scoring model that affords more weight to the trust level, just like, a passport is more credible than a phone bill. Although on that note, nothing of that is credible due to the growth of AI. Behavioral heuristics, and I mean machine learning to identify transaction patterns that suggest problematic behavior, wallets that rapidly interact with unaudited contracts, for example. And finally, very importantly, AI agent signaling. This is logic that can be implemented that effectively susses out agentic activity and thus prompts stricter review. And we're obviously seeing explosive growth of AI agents on chain. One other note here, I personally feel very passionate about privacy. It's something Starkware is obviously focused on. It should be the default here. And I think this is an important part of the conversation right now. If you go to any crypto conference, especially an institutional one, everyone is obsessively talking about payments, tokenization, and stables, right? So, one day, if you tokenize all the assets and bring them on chain, realistically, from just a competitive standpoint, you're not going to have major hedge funds or financial institutions wanting to do all of their trading on chain with that degree of visibility. So from the very commercial standpoint, privacy needs to be part of the conversation, separate apart from the principles of, privacy as an American fundamental right. So ZK proofs and selective disclosures can allow users to prove a host of things, for example, that they're not sanctioned actors, and these credentials can be revocable and theoretically portable. So privacy as the normal essentially shifts the compliance model from one of constant surveillance to one of verifiable trust. Last point I'll make, and then I'll pause. What would a risk scoring standard look like? It's a very difficult question. We're still very early in this discussion. I like drawing a parallel to the use of blockchain analytics and smart contract audits in DeFi. These were industry-imposed, self-imposed standards. I'll also note that there's often an embrace of these ideas when it comes to hack risk. For example, SEALs efforts. Everyone within DeFi wants to do everything they can to ensure the integrity of contracts. But there is also occasionally a knee-jerk negative or defensive reaction when these concepts are raised in the context of regulatory or criminal risk. That should not be the case. These conversations need to happen, and they need to happen now if the industry wants to mature and grow and not plateau. So I would encourage all of you to check out the paper. I would encourage you to send it to legislators and policymakers, but also to builders. One of my favorite parts of the paper is actually a chart at the end where we walk through all of the optional functionality that exists. My dream is that a builder, before he or she sits down to build, goes through and just considers, am I even aware of these options? Are they appropriate for the tech that I'm building? So we strive to be thought-provoking. Back to you, Paul, unless anyone has any questions.
No, so sorry about that. I was just making an adjustment on Zoom. Thank you for
No
that
worries.
fascinating discussion. I'm going to have to go back and watch that video again and pull out all those nuggets that you shared because it's so fascinating.
I covered a lot of ground. There's a lot in the paper. It's
There's
20
a
plus
lot.
pages, but it's worth reading.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we are unfortunately really late on our schedule today. So we have two more speakers. I'm going to have to ask them to go quick, or if they prefer, we could bring them on next time. But Veronica, let's go to you and see if you can just give us a quick update. Let me see if I can adjust the Zoom.
Hey there. I'll go quick. My name is Veronica Irwin. I'm an independent journalist and research consultant. And I just wanted to talk about a report that I published with the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Paradigm, Justin Slaughter, on Monday. And it's called Bridging the Gap, How Crypto Expands Financial Access for America's Underbanked. Just a little bit of context. This report was about a population of people called unbanked and underbanked. Unbanked is pretty simple to understand. It's just people that don't have a bank account. But underbanked is a little bit more vague, so I want to provide the definition. And it's a person who does have a checking account, but who uses non-bank financial products like non-bank money orders, check cashing, international remittances, or peer-to-peer payment apps like Venmo or PayPal to meet core financial needs. So to pay their rent, to buy their groceries, keep the lights on, things like that. And that definition is what is used when the federal government does research on this population. So we didn't just make it up. You see it referenced in reports by the Federal Reserve, FDIC, CFPB, and the like. Globally, the World Bank estimates there's about 1.4 billion people who were unbanked in 2021. So that's 24% of the world's adults. I was really startled by that. Luckily, the percentage is smaller in the United States, but it's still significant. The Federal Reserve Board estimates that about 6% of American adults were unbanked in 2024, and even more were underbanked. And this percentage is particularly high amongst low-income adults, young people, Black and Hispanic Americans, and also people with disabilities. And so as I kind of just suggested, there's been plenty of research to look at how many people fall into these categories and also how many of them use crypto. The Federal Reserve estimates about 3% of Americans are using crypto because they don't trust banks, and there's an overlap with the underbanked population, for example. But there's not very much research into how and why they use crypto. And that's what we set out to try to understand. So rather than doing a poll or trying to like quantify this population with like a survey, we went the route of doing like in-depth qualitative interviews with people that fell into this category to kind of start the conversation, and hopefully that yields, more research to kind of understand how these reasons break down across the broader population. But we did in-depth interviews with 11 unbanked and underbanked people. These were like 1-hour interviews, in-depth, one-on-one conversations. And they were also granted anonymity. So we hope that yielded a little bit more, people to be a little bit more transparent, especially because a lot of these people were immigrants and several of them had documentation issues. But what we found was pretty surprising, I thought. Across the board, pretty much everybody said that they had issues with trusting traditional banks, and that was like a major reason why they used crypto. They talked about how they felt using crypto for everyday payments was actually more secure than credit cards or debit cards. Several of them had instances where they, made a purchase online and their credit card information was stolen. And they would bring up how, to make an online purchase, they have to put in all their credit card information and like trust some third party with it. But with crypto, they didn't have to disclose everything in that same way. I guess somewhat predictably, there was a lot of talk about efficiency as well. People that just did not understand why a payment took so long to settle, took several days often to settle with traditional finance when they had used crypto and they had seen it settle within a couple of minutes. We saw a similar trend talking about fees associated with payments. And this was particularly acute for people that were regularly sending money abroad. So especially our immigrant population that was sending money back home, they saw exceptionally high fees and even longer processing times. I think a lot of us are kind of familiar with this use case for crypto, but I think it was a good reminder how often this came up. But what I found the most interesting was how consistently people talked about crypto changing their perceptions of money. Most of the folks we talked to would identify as low income. And so they were used to being in a paycheck to paycheck mindset and kind of like a financial survivalist kind of mindset and, focused on how to stretch their dollar. But they talked about once they started using crypto, how they tried to start thinking like, okay, is there any portion of this that I can save? Is there any portion of this that I can invest? What about staking? What about like getting a yield on my holdings? That just weren't things they were really thinking about when it came to money and how to budget their finances before. And a lot of them talked about, just kind of using money as like a method to thrive and like better their financial circumstances. Whereas before they were exposed to crypto, they weren't really thinking about it that way or didn't see that potential for themselves. There's a lot more to the full report. I tried to kind of make it like a cheat sheet of all the data that is out there that is relevant to this conversation, in addition to, conveying anecdotes and like portions of the interview, quotes from different people. Everybody's given a pseudonym, but just to kind of give you an idea of the personalities of people that crypto is attracting in this like unbanked and underbanked population. So I encourage everybody to read the full report. It's at paradigm.xyz under the research tab. And if you have any questions, please reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I check my DM requests on X as well. My at's Vron Irwin, VRON IRWIN, or all the Project Glitch people have my email as well. Thanks.
Veronica, thank you. I can just taking all that in and just imagining thinking of money as a way to thrive. It's just like blowing my mind. That was a joke.
I was emotional doing some of these interviews, honestly, talking about that with people. It was really cool.
Wonderful research. I encourage everybody to check it out. Zach, do you want to give just a 1-minute update, or do you want to hold until next time? It's up to you.
Let's do it. I love a 1-minute update. Let's do this thing.
Okay, let me get you on screen.
All right. All right, I see me on screen. I'm gonna dive into this thing. Saw me on screen. There I am. Hey everybody, good to see you. Really fascinating stuff. Summer, I thought those insights were really fascinating. Catherine as well. Taylor, thanks so much. And Veronica, really appreciate it. I'm Zach Seward, editor-in-chief of a magazine called Use Case. It is indeed a print magazine. I'm holding in my hands the very first copy of said print magazine. Some of you in that room may have received a copy. I know Paul has gotten a couple. So if you really want to get your hands on this thing, as some already have, to go deep on some topics that are important to the crypto community, this is the magazine for you. You may also request a copy at usecase.xyz. We'll do our best to get you some. But this is a really cool project that includes a lot of the nuance, depth that I think we lack in the current crypto media environment. So again, usecase.xyz, also Swarm Paul, if you want to get one of a few copies that we've sent his way. And that's all I got. Signing off. I'm Zach. I'll toss it back to you, Paul. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Unfortunately, I don't have those copies today, so you're going to have to follow up with me. But I'll have them soon, and I'll get them to you. Thanks for that. And also, Zach, thanks for your work on the DC Privacy Summit, by the way. If you all know, he was here as our MC. All right, I'm going to pass over the meeting to Mike. Sorry for running a little late, Mike, and I'm sorry I have to run. But thank you all for being here. We'll see you next time.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for coming to PGP. My name is Mike Orcutt. I'm a technology journalist and founding editor of Project Glitch. We have published a newsletter that you should subscribe to, projectglitch.xyz. And we organize what we call journalistically curated events. And our flagship, I think Paul mentioned it a few times, was the second annual DC Privacy Summit, which some of you were here for that last month. Appreciate that. So today we're going to have a conversation about a possible fork in the road. Thanks in part to the Genius Act, which has called on the Treasury to reevaluate how it thinks about anti-money laundering, specifically in the context of digital assets. And our two panelists are engaging directly with this opportunity in their work in different ways and also collaboratively. We'll talk about that, but first I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves and tell you what they're working on, because they can do that much better than I can. So let's start with James.
Hey everyone, James Fulgenzi, Head of Public Policy at Proof. We're really a trust provider for the internet focused on identity verification and fraud protection across a bunch of different transactions, and have been doing some exciting work with Lightspark and obviously some exciting work on the policy side that we're looking forward to getting into today.
Hi everyone, I'm Zahi Masari. I'm going to tell you about two different hats because they're both important to this conversation. First, I'm a co-founder and chief legal officer at Lightspark, which is a company that's building enterprise payments on the Bitcoin Lightning Network. And then second, I split my time doing outside legal work and policy work at a boutique law firm called Arcturus, which advises lots and lots. Yes, thank you. I love it too. There, I'm focusing largely on stablecoin projects, including thinking about AML, KYC, and other similar topics as Genius starts to get rolled out through what's going to be a super intense regulatory implementation process. But the topic we're going to talk about today actually hits on both of these hats because Lightspark, an initiative that I'm leading there, is working to actually just use verified credentials as part of our regulated payment services. And at the same time, I've been working with James and his colleagues on the policy side to try to, in fact, make it possible for financial institutions like Lightspark Payments, which is our regulated payments affiliate, to have legal comfort that when they use verified credentials as part of their financial crimes compliance programs, that they won't be treated what I would say improperly for relying on verified credentials rather than using old-fashioned methods. And then Mike is going to help us tie this all to the privacy topic elegantly, as he always does.
I'm going to come back to Zahi. I think you've got us started a little bit there, but if you could frame out this conversation a little bit more. I used the opportunity earlier. I'm wondering, is that the right word? Is that opportunity specifically due to the Genius Act? And what is that opportunity? What is that chance exactly?
Yep. So, in my view, this is a view I came to be honest, over the course of a few years, having slogged away at crypto payments for a long time, even before I was at Lightspark, working on lots of stablecoin projects, including some headline-making ones for better or worse. I started to realize that we have a real problem under US regulations, maybe more importantly, under guidance for financial institutions from FinCEN and other banking regulators, that really makes it not possible for them to start to think about using some of the newer approaches that we tend to like for their financial crimes compliance. And I'll be really specific because this is the thing that James and I have been working on in particular. The way that financial institutions have to run their compliance programs today is by verifying information that they collect from their customers to verify identity and other characteristics like, are they on a sanctions list? Are they on a US sanctions list? Are they sanctioned people? They think about things like collecting information to understand credit risk of customers, of understanding reputational risk of their customers. And they need to, the way the financial institutions from banks down to money transmitters, the way they understand their compliance obligations today is that they have to collect that information directly from customers. So what this means, in short, is that it's really hard to move financial institution compliance departments away from that idea without some comfort that they can do so. Why is that? Because these compliance departments have zero incentive, and in fact, a lot of negative incentive to change how they're doing things. Because when something goes wrong, they get in trouble. But if they have a process improvement, they rarely get credit for that, right? That ends up being a business improvement, not a compliance improvement. And so we need to find a way to give financial institutions the support they need on the compliance side to pull our vision of better KYC AML processes and better financial crimes compliance processes, including, in my view, with verifiable credentials, which we can talk about how they are actually going to work with Lightspark and with others and what Proof is doing. Now I'll get off my soapbox.
I'm going to follow up though, because I want to clarify: do you think that the opportunity here is specifically due to Genius? Are you also afraid that the crypto industry could miss this opportunity? And then what are you kind of doing? This is actually a three-part question. What are you doing to yourself in terms of taking meetings to try to avoid missing that opportunity?
Great. It's like you're a journalist. You're keeping me honest and asking the question again when I don't answer it. Thank you. So look, I think the opportunity does exist in part because of Genius. Genius has an entire title devoted to asking the regulators in the industry to explain, provide comments to the government, and come up with better ways of doing AML and illicit finance reviews in the context of stablecoin payments. In my view, that's a broader opening than just stablecoin payments. We all in the industry should see that as a way to inform the same regulators, the banking regulators, FinCEN, the Department of Treasury, who deal with AML sanctions and illicit finance in broader context. It's a huge opportunity. It's not only because of Genius, but that is a huge, huge door that's been open to, and we have to walk through it. To the second and third part of your question, I'm going to let James talk a little bit about our policy efforts, but I think crypto has a unique ability to miss opportunities sometimes, and this is exactly that kind of opportunity. I think there's two ways we could miss it. One, by not doing enough, and two, by trying to do too much. I love the idea of all of us owning our own credentials and being able to deploy them, and that's it. I think that is not going to be the first step. We need ways for law enforcement to get additional information from people when they need it. They need to issue subpoenas to somebody. And I don't think we all want to be the subject of subpoenas answering information about ourselves because we're the only ones that hold information about us available to financial institutions and law enforcement. I think we need to take steps to get there. And so I'm going to hand it over to James, or Mike is going to hand it over to James.
Yeah, we can go. We're going to move back to James now. Zai's kind of painted the bigger picture for us, and if I'm understanding correctly, Proof is working on a kind of a piece of that picture. It has launched what it calls a digital credential solution to power modern compliance for digital asset services. So I want to unpack that just a bit, specifically the term digital credential solution. So just so that we're clear on what we're talking about, in this case, what is the digital credential? How is it? What does it consist of? How does it work? And how does it compare to other things that people refer to as credentials?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's super important. And I'll kind of split it up because I know we're going to get back to the policy a little later, and I think it can be defined in that context slightly differently. It's kind of two sides of a very similar coin. But in particular to the partnership between Proof and Lightspark, I think we tend to get really caught up on the specific digital credential that will be presented. Our goal is for both in our product partnership and our policy partnership for the framework to be interoperable, to exist to a lot of the open standards around digital credentials that are out there. What we're really advocating for on the product side is what matters is, can you trust the person who basically underwrites that credential, the institution that is performing the verifications? And so the way that Proof is solving that is through digital certificate technology. So instead of going down a technical rabbit hole and kind of what that all means, but it's PKI, I'm sure a lot of the people in the room are familiar, we've become a certificate authority. And to do that and to issue various digital certificates, we have to have a certificate policy that states what we're going to do when verifying someone. And so we'll have a defined process that is audited and rigorous for what kinds of verifications we're going to put somebody through, whether it's identity verification or in the context of the partnership, entity level, so like bank level sanction screening. And so what's great about this is an auditable process and it's public. You can see kind of what the framework is going to be. And so, if you're in banking, you know that banks have consistent policies for how they do these things. And it's about 90% the same across from bank to bank. We're all kind of doing the same thing. Our goal is to solve that 90% so that there's a common language and a common architecture so you can show up with a credential that's been verified to this standard that is known to an entity, they understand it, and they can instantly trust it. So that's a little bit more of the specifics of what we're doing on the partnership level. And when we get back to the policy, I'm happy to speak a little bit more about the specific role of verifiable digital credentials and what we're proposing for FinCEN.
Mike, maybe I can describe, building off of James's description, how Lightspark is going to use these credentials, because I think that's actually something new and something that I'm very excited about. So Lightspark, as I mentioned, is building enterprise payments on the Bitcoin Lightning Network. This is an open network, right? There's no central operator deciding who can access the network, who can't access the network. This is something we all care about a lot, right? The network should be neutral. That being said, our customers that include US banks like SoFi, non-US banks like Nubank, EU banks like Revolut, these institutions need to understand who they're transacting with, and in fact need to make ex-ante decisions. Can I transact with this network participant that wants to engage in payments activity with me? That requirement fundamentally is never going to change. And so we need a way to provide assurances between network participants who don't have commercial agreements between them to engage in payments, because that closes the network and doesn't scale, so that they can understand who they're dealing with and whether it's okay for them to deal with those people. So one important piece of this is the digital verifiable credential that at first is going to be issued by Proof. The first idea is super simple and really obvious, which is Proof is going to review network participants for sanctions, US sanction screening. Proof will issue SoFi a certificate that SoFi can use to sign messages with counterparties on the network using our UMA messaging protocol that just says, I'm not on a US sanctions list. This is the very tip of the iceberg, right? But it's powerful because this tells other network participants the minimum thing they need to be able to transact with others. This person is not on a US sanctions list, or maybe it's an EU sanctions list, or maybe it's a UN list, like whatever. We will deal with those standards with Proof as we need them based on what our network participants find the most useful. We can then, one more thing, move on to other credentials, right? So identity is one piece of it. It's the customer's customer. not being sanctioned. It's their identity, basic identity information that can be credentialized and shared on this messaging platform. And what it means is network participants don't themselves have to run these reviews and screen them. This makes network interactions real time, I think, for the first time, and it's kind of a big deal, and I get excited about it, as you can tell.
Did you have something to add?
Nope. Answer
Okay.
the point on kind of the fact that the key thing, if you're picking up the thread, is this is solving that re-verification issue from institution to institution. We're all relying on a common framework and a common language. We don't need to re-verify all of these attributes every single time, which I think is a good bridge back to the policy discussion.
Yeah, so because this is a simple, like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's a simple step that you're talking about, but even then requires sort of a philosophical change in DC. So you've been sitting down with regulators and policymakers as well as Zai, and you also, I think, submitted a comment to the Treasury for their request for information. What is this philosophical shift? What are you trying to convince people of here in DC?
Yeah, so the existing laws give FinCEN and other regulators relatively broad flexibility in how they interpret this and modernize, right? So we don't need to go back to Congress and necessarily rewrite the rules in this context. And so what we're proposing is a new reliance framework, right? And the shift is, instead of a financial institution having to do the verifications themselves and extract that information from the user when they're onboarding or when they're interacting with the system, that can be done through a credentialing process, right, by a credential service provider. And then you can show up to that institution with this trusted credential, and they can extract the information that's necessary to move forward, whether it's opening an account or processing a transaction. So that shift is the reliance framework. So instead of the bank having to do it themselves every single time, we're allowing these credential services providers to enter the market and to deliver verifiable digital credentials to users to interact across traditional and crypto.
One more question for you, just to follow up. So we at the Privacy Summit last month, we talked a lot about zero knowledge cryptography and sort of emerging cryptographic tools, and we haven't brought that up so far in this conversation. Where do those technologies kind of come into play here? Do you have to sort of accomplish something first and then build on top of the credential that you already have? And did the regulators, is that another conversation to have with regulators, or is that part of this same conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure Zai has thoughts as well. But if you do a lot of work in Washington, you know that people really like pilots and whatnot. But like I mentioned, we don't need new authority to do this. So instead of asking for everything right now, we think this is a really good way to start to test what's available here. Zai mentioned earlier that the underlying law enforcement obligations still exist. So at the end of the day, the information in these contexts, right, specifically talking about these regulated entities, is still required to be there. But Proof is working towards zero knowledge proofs. We'll continue to do that regardless of this context, because I think there's a lot of value across tons of different transactions. But you can imagine a world where instead of having to extract the underlying information or have somebody ultimately be able to stand by it and say, I have a record of what I did and here's the information, here's the bank statements and your utility bill, you could just show up to a financial institution and say, I am over the age of 21, I'm a US citizen, I'm not on a sanctions list, I'm permitted to do banking in a zero knowledge proof. And so that may require, and folks in the room are studying this, we're looking at it, we'd love to have those conversations, that may require underlying legislative changes to really allow that switch, but we think that first philosophical change is really the important one to kind of get regulators more in the lens of a third-party reliance framework.
A couple points on that, and I think this vision piece is actually really important because it's hard to really understand how big of a change this is unless you take a step back and zoom out a bunch, which is the world that I want, and really how I started thinking about this at Lightspark and then started working with Proof, is to think about my wallet. I have my own credentials. I might have 100 different characteristics credentialized. I don't know. And my wallet will look across the landscape and say, Zai wants to engage in this particular type of financial activity or this type of transaction. Here are the 17 credentials she needs in order to onboard with a financial institution or onboard with a service provider. And if I don't have those credentials, maybe my wallet will help me go get them. Or we'll just present those credentials to the financial institution that I want to onboard with, and that's it. right? The financial institution relies on the credentials because it can understand what those credentials are, it knows who's issued them, and law enforcement knows that when that credential is presented, they can go to the credentialing authority to get additional information if they need it. Like, I think that is a realistic first next world step, and that, to be honest, is what we're trying to build to. I also hate pilots. I think they tend to pick winners and losers. They tend to pick technologies too early. What we want to see is just guidance that says financial institutions can use verifiable credentials as part of their AML processes. I think that's all we need. I think sometimes in crypto, we want too much regulatory certainty, and it prohibits anything from happening. We just need to lower the wall a little bit so that financial institutions can jump over it, because I think they see immense cost saving and immense benefits from this too. We just need to make it possible.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing on specifically on the privacy side for the framework that we're representing here. Privacy is something that's incredibly important to, is a foundational principle to proof, right? And so if you think about this does not necessarily require the financial institution to request that scanned copy of your passport every single time you visit every institution. So if your local community bank does not have the same security standards as a big bank in New York City, you don't need to run the risk that you're going to have your information leaked in a breach. So instead of spreading your information over the 15 different financial institutions that you interact with over the course of a 15-year period, you can have one credential that can be relied upon across that network. Of course, this is going to require participation, but we think the benefits on both compliance speed, compliance, just meeting compliance burdens, efficiencies for consumers and internal, there'll be enough incentive, but that privacy component, I think for folks in this room, is still something that's really important to keep in mind.
One more question that I'm going to have each of you weigh in on, and then we should have time to take some questions if there are any from the audience. Basically, what you're describing is you can imagine a world where decentralized payment systems or stablecoin issuers are able to manage the risk in their systems decently well using only verifiable credentials. But could this really eliminate the need for those service providers to collect and store some information about their users? Will that require a change to the Bank Secrecy Act? Sort of, this is the long-term vision, but I'm interested in both of you guys weighing in on this.
I mean, I'll start by saying yes and yes, but I don't know, Zai, if you want to add?
Yes, and maybe. It depends. I think that's the lawyerly answer. Look, I think we really need to see where this is going. I don't have a clear vision entirely of the future. I think we can get a really, really long way without amending the BSA. I think we can do a lot of work through guidance. And really, when it comes down to it, I think we need to show that the system works. I don't think it eliminates the need for financial institutions, banks, and others to retain any information about their users. Just as one example, they'll still know more about the transactions that their users are engaging in than anyone else will. And so simple transaction monitoring data will need to be kept at the financial institutions, right? And I think that's fine. That's fine, and we shouldn't expect anything different. But I think just this shift from having every financial institution collect all of the information and then review it all again and again, that in itself is an enormous change and something worth fighting for.
And just to loop back to the call to action earlier, right? For those regulated entities, if we don't lean in and engage now, they're just going to apply the rules the way that they're drafted now, which are not going to work for digitally native solutions. And this is also just an opportunity to modernize, we think, every corner of the ecosystem. But what is there, 2003, regulations would likely be applied. So I think this is an important moment to lean in.
Cool, thank you. Any questions from the audience? I've got a microphone. I've got a lot of questions.
Thank you. I have been in and around these issues for way too long. And we're coming up on the 25th anniversary next year of the Patriot Act, 9/11, obviously. I've been a big believer from the beginning that we're only going to make the system better by having some ability to share be able to reliably share upon it. You've mentioned the fact that, and I've seen various iterations as technology has evolved over the years of proposals coming up to have sort of this verified credential that could be shared across organizations. One of the biggest issues has always come to the verifying organization, and I think you used the term, you used it in a plural, that there would be multiple types of entities to do this, but that's always been the breakdown, because how can you trust who it is that's basically doing the verification process? So I'm curious as to your thoughts along those lines. And then also, there's a framework in place for information sharing under 314B, which turns in part on use of a not-for-profit as opposed to a for-profit, though exceptions have been made. The early warning system run by the banks is a good example of that. Are you giving any kind of thought in the context of those types of infrastructure issues to address some of the issues that you're talking about?
I mean, just to speak for Proof for a second, we're very interested in the concept of fraud sharing, so happy to talk offline about that specific component. It's not directly addressed here, but to your first question, we've contemplated a couple different things, and I'll try to keep this as high level as possible. But for KYC SIP, for identity verification and just identity verification, we think that the new NIST IL2 standards provide a really good framework for how to identify somebody and then issue them a digital credential. So that's a published referenceable standard for how to identify somebody and then contain those attributes inside of a credential. There's also mobile driver's licenses. There's been a lot of tests between NIST and banks on using mobile driver's licenses for SIP. That's another option. And third, and this is kind of the cornerstone of the entire Reliance framework, and I think Zai can add to this, is all of the processes need to be substantially similar to what the bank is doing today, right? So they need to have a relationship with the credential service provider and understanding that the process that they're essentially handing off is going to be done to the same standards that they would expect if they were doing it themselves internally. So that is another part of the shift that I think is really important. I don't know if you'd want to add to that.
Yeah, they're really great questions. I think information sharing is one really important aspect of this. We haven't figured everything out yet. I think waiting to figure everything out means you're never going to actually get anywhere. I think another really, really important point to be sorted out is liability apportionment between the credentialing authority and the banks, and individuals, right? Because if the credentialing authority gets a credential wrong and the bank relies on it and hasn't done its own verification, right? There are all sorts of different liability questions that come from that. And those are things that we're working through and welcome input and thoughts on not only all of the issues, which there are many, but also how to solve them.
Any other questions?
Hey, so in a good amount of my work, I deal with casinos specifically, and obviously they fall into this rabbit hole of money transmitter that is totally different from banks and everything else. But I was just curious, given a lot of the constants between banks and casinos, and especially in these cases you're talking about, specifically your AML, KYC compliance, et cetera, how does what you're working on kind of play into two parts that, to me, two specific parts, which are number one, self-exclusion, which generally is on a state level and how do you balance privacy versus if you're on, say, Maryland self-exclusion list, does that apply to Nevada and everything else too? And the second piece is, the sports books and the casinos all like to talk to each other about who's winning too much before they, basically freeze someone out entirely. Kind of how does those two operations kind of interplay in the unique wedge that casinos are in?
I have a few thoughts, unless you want to go ahead. Yeah. And I'm going to actually punt it over to James in a moment. But so we haven't really thought a lot about the casino-specific issues, and I'm sure Proof would be delighted to talk to you about those because we've been focused on our narrow payments use case because that's my business and not as much casinos. But I think it's a really good point. I think the way you're thinking about it is really important because what you're pointing out is there's all sorts of information that would be good to credentialize. And then there's a bunch of information that we probably should be very careful about credentializing. And we had this conversation in the context of sanctions screening. Would we ever want to issue this person is on a sanctions list credential. Like, is that a helpful thing to do in the world? Is it useful? Is it bad? Is it good? And so I think there is also a lot of philosophical conversations to be had. And again, maybe it's just because I'm at a startup now and no longer at a law firm, but I think if we try to sort out all those questions first, we won't make progress. And so these are things that we really we're going to have to grapple with. It's a really good point. And you should talk to James.
Yeah, I mean, we're uniquely focused on this opportunity because of, I think, what is at stake in the opportunity here. But I mean, I think an indirect way to answer your question is like an underlying principle is the concept of portability, right? So you can take that credential and it can be trusted by multiple institutions. So if that works for your framework, then there's a way to align around what those underlying principles are, and then the contained characteristic can be shared amongst the user can share it amongst participating entities, and then they understand kind of how to read and interpret that. So to Zai's point, there's a multitude of different characteristics that can be ultimately verified and embedded inside a verifiable digital credential, right? There's folks that are working on diplomas. There are, a whole host of different use cases that can go into these things.
Here we have one more over here.
Hi, I'm Justin with StableCon. I'm a former bank regulator, and one observation I would make is that, over the last generation, enforcement actions around AML and sanctions compliance shortcomings have been a very popular theme amongst my colleagues and brought in, a lot of fines. And this is really driven by, the complexities of setting up quality compliance programs, and mistakes are made, and it's like every financial institution has to reinvent the wheel. So I guess the question is, why don't we see sort of a stronger consensus among regulators that rather than having institutions try to reinvent the wheel every time and making a lot of mistakes, we should turn this over to the pros and have, I think I've said enough. Like, you see where I'm going with this. Let's do better.
I agree. Why haven't we seen it yet? This is a really good question. I don't know the answer. For my own part, I've only been paying attention to it really for a couple of years since I started trying to figure out how we can do better at Lightspark, and that's really what spurred all of this work. I think there's just a lot of entrenched interests in banking regulators, in examiners, within the banks themselves, right? Again, the incentive is heavy inertia to stand still. And I think there's also a lot of people who want to do better in every single one of those institutions, and we're just seeing a tug of war. I don't know a better answer. Maybe people here who have more experience do. Right, and I think, this is maybe that's a much more elegant way of saying what I was trying to say, to be honest, which is it's hard to change because there's bunches of questions that get opened when you try to do something different and try to do something new, and that is hard at banks. Like, that is just hard no matter what topic you're talking about. And so, I think there's a lot to overcome, and I think that's part of the job.
One way we're looking to address this, right, is specifically on SIP and the NIST IL2 process. There are independent nonprofit organizations that act as assessors to credential servicing providers. One of them is the Kantara Initiative. And so we have a trust mark from them that we've gone through an independent audit that says that we will comply with the NIST standards to identify this individual. And so we have recommended to regulators that instead of not only helping to change these regulations, but then reinvent kind of the compliance wheel and create a new regulatory body, which they wouldn't do to assess all of these individual providers, to work with some of these assessment communities that provide these independent trust marks to help have trusted vendors that operate in the ecosystem. And so a lot of this is built, in addition to that, on open standards. Those bodies have similar trust marks. So there's a way to still have something that you can show up to a financial institution. If you're a technology vendor and you're working with a bank, you know what that due diligence process is like. So there's a lot of information that will need to be presented and tested before there's ever an integration. And so our hope is that FinCEN will recognize that some of these frameworks exist, and help to elevate them and give them, you know, a semblance of to be recognized, you know, in the community and used when we're talking with various institutions.
Cool. I think that's a good spot to end. Thank you, James and Zaid. Thanks everyone for coming.